When New York journalist Lenore Skenazy decided a couple of years ago to cut her 9-year-old son Izzy loose in a Manhattan department store with instructions on how to find his own way home on the subway, she had no inkling of what she was about to start. In no time at all, she'd been labelled America's worst mother. One of her responses was to declare a take your kids to the park and leave them there day. Another was to write a book called Free Range Kids, with a lot of apparently provocative advice on how to raise safe, self-reliant children. Skenazy is one player in a now international debate about the rights and wrongs of the so-called helicopter parent syndrome. That's the parents who constantly hover over their children to reduce the risks they might be exposed to. Lenore Skenazy is in Sydney for the Festival of Dangerous Ideas at the Sydney Opera House this coming weekend, and that's where I spoke with her today. Lenore Skenazy, I'm sure you'd agree you're not the first modern parent to decide to remove some of the cotton wool wrapping from your young child's life, although not everyone would choose a Manhattan subway to do it as a starting point. But were you surprised by America's reaction?
I was dumbfounded, I think is the word. Shocked beyond belief. I mean, I let my son take the subway at age 9. My husband and I had talked about it. We thought it seemed like a good idea since our son was asking us. We thought, he's ready. We're on the subways all the time. It seems safe. He's familiar with it. And afterwards, I wrote about it like a month later because it wasn't even that big a deal. And then 2 days later, I was on every possible television station in America defending my decision. And that's how I found out that not everybody thought that this was a good idea.
So how did you, and how do you still, define acceptable risk for Izzy, who is now 12?
He's 12. Well, what I like to do usually, the only way that works for me is I try to think back to my own childhood and what my mom let me do, because she was a stay-at-home mom. She was very concerned. She was protective. And yet, back then, we were allowed to do all sorts of things that are considered radical now. I walked to school when I was in first grade. I rode my bicycle to the library. I went to the public pool and trusted the lifeguards to save me and not my mom to be standing there. And that's what I try to do, too. I try to think, well, if I was okay at those ages and my mom trusted me, considering the world has not become more dangerous in America in the intervening decades.
Now, how do you know that? Because a lot of people would just instinctively say, well, of course the world has changed.
People say that all the time, and I say, yes, the world has changed. In fact, it actually is safer. I mean, I know it's impossible to believe, and it's really hard to digest the fact that there was more crime back when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s than there is now. And your crime rate, by the way, I looked it up, is also going down since the 90s. But we don't feel that way at all. I mean, I know that everybody says, oh, I loved my childhood. I loved riding my bike around the neighborhood. I would never let my kid do that now because times have changed. And I say, well, let's just examine that for a second. If times hadn't changed, would you let them out? And then they keep going on that the times are so much more, they're more nervous. And that's the fact. We are more nervous. We see stories from around the world that are the worst stories that are shown to us on a nightly basis. I just got here, right? I just got to Sydney today, this morning, and I'm so proud. I figured out how to turn on the TV in the hotel room, yay, technology and me. And the story was about J.C. Dugard. J.C. Dugard is the girl who was kidnapped at age 11 in California. I know from my trip last night, that's 11,000 miles away from you. Kidnapped at age 11 and found again at age 29, and she'd been kept in captivity. It's the worst story in the world. But you're hearing it here. When my parents were raising me, they weren't hearing these stories. The news was shorter. You didn't have 24-hour cable. You didn't have CSI. You didn't have Law and Order. You had more cheerful, less depressing, less anxiety-producing stories on TV. And I think now, when you say times have changed, that's what's changed. People are watching CNN. People go to their hotel room, and the first thing they turn on is a story about a girl who was in captivity for 18 years. A weird, anomalous story that now makes you think, oh, I shouldn't let my kid ever go outside. Look what happened to J.C.
You've written the chapters of your book as a series of free-range commandments.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, don't think like a lawyer. Yeah. Some risks are worth it. Can you expand on that one briefly?
Yeah, I think that we are thinking like lawyers a lot now because our society is so litigious, especially in America. For instance, one kid fell off a swing maybe 20 years ago, broke her arm, sued the park district, and suddenly park districts across America started taking out high swings. They started taking out teeter-totters, seesaws. They started taking out merry-go-rounds. And so they started thinking like lawyers, and then we started internalizing the idea that, like, oh my God, it must be very dangerous for our children to do these things if they're being removed from regular life. And everything started seeming so dangerous that we sort of forgot, like, yes, some things are a little dangerous. You go on a merry-go-round, there's a chance you'll fall off. There's a chance your kid might break an arm. There's also a chance they'll have a fantastic time. They'll lose weight. They'll be fit. They'll have something fun to do after school instead of just turning on the TV or going to the computer. But we always think in terms of the what-if, worst-case scenario, and that's thinking like a lawyer, because a lawyer could go to court and say, we knew that these merry-go-rounds are dangerous, and why did they have one there? I'm asking you. And we think ahead to that point and get rid of anything fun, even if the risk is tiny, because we think a tiny risk even is not worth it.
You talk also about the Kiddie safety industrial complex.
Ah, my favorite. Yes.
Which I suppose is connected to what you've just talked about, but
right.
but more so where you would say commercial enterprises play on that danger aspect to sell products.
Well, they sure do. I know you guys have Toys R Us. I passed one on the way in, and Babies R Us. Babies R Us is a store that didn't exist even when I was a child, and yet now they're filled with 10,000 different items, from everything from like a little hat that your child can wear in the tub so that they won't get any suds in their eyes, to the faucet cover, to the temperature duck, a little rubber duck that you put in your tub, and if you turn it upside down, it tells you the temperature, and not the exact temperature, it tells you hot. And the idea is like, can't we possibly figure that out on our own? Are our children really so in danger of being scalded by the bathwater that we put our own hands in? But the fact that all these products exist make you start thinking that their dangers are everywhere. And when you start internalizing that, it's sort of the risk thing. It's like, well, maybe my child wouldn't be blinded by the suds, but just in case, I'll buy the sud screen. You
use an example of Sesame Street, the DVD of old Sesame Street.
Yeah. Well, Sesame Street has a DVD collection called Sesame Street Old School from the late 60s to the mid-70s. And it shows kids doing very fun things. It shows them playing in a vacant lot, and they balance on a piece of wood, and they play tag, and there's no certified PhD tag supervisor there. It's just kids playing with kids. And before you see any of this, which remember was put on to model a halcyon childhood. Before you see any of this, a warning comes on screen, and it says, for adult viewing only. The Sesame Street could not even endorse its old-fashioned idea from one generation ago of what childhood should be. Now, what they were showing is considered dangerous and horrible and negligent. But they know it's not. They wouldn't have put it on TV if it was truly a bad idea. They weren't showing kids in the mines. They were showing kids on Sesame Street meeting the characters. No, don't meet your neighbors. Stay inside. Watch a screen, kids. Watch Sesame Street.
And what about the fear that if you do allow your child to take what you might regard as an acceptable risk, that in doing so, if something happens, that there's a backlash on you, whether it's from your neighbours, your friends, or from the media?
I think that the fear of blame is one of the things that is making parents even more afraid than just watching the TV, because it feels like if I had run away from my mom at the fair when I was 5 years old a million years ago, and, it took a half hour to find me, and say I twisted my ankle, people would go, kids, they're always getting into trouble, or what can you do, or poor you, Mrs. Skenazy. And now it's, why weren't you holding on to her? Why didn't you have her on a leash? Why didn't you have her number written on her arm? Why didn't she have a cell phone? Why didn't you GPS her? It's all your fault. The assumption is that nothing bad ever happens to a child unless there's a terrible parent. So parents fear anything happening to their kids, not just because they want their kids to be safe, but because they know that they're not going to get a lot of sympathy. They're going to get a lot of blame.
Now, it's one thing for Lenore Skenazy to allow her child to be exposed to what she regards as acceptable risk. What if somebody else follows your advice and something happens to their child? How do you feel about that?
I'll tell you, I went through a horrible week last May. I declared take our children to the park and leave them there day, which you guys covered here, which was an idea. I just wanted kids to get outside and go to the local park and then find other kids there and have to play with them while we went around the block. And so we didn't organize the game and we didn't choose the teams. And so many people jumped on me. It was a front page story in New York saying, this is going to be a Predators field day and you're setting a banquet for the worst of humanity and they're all going to prey upon. And I spent 3 days shaking terribly, worrying, oh my God, if something happens, I will be blamed and it will never be seen as just coincidence. And then to get some perspective for myself, I looked up some statistics and I thought, okay, in the same day that I'm saying children should go to the park, 769 children will be diagnosed with diabetes. That's in the United States. That's twice as many as 10 years ago. Nobody says, how dare you let your child stay inside? What if they get diabetes? Nobody says that. How dare you let your kids stay at home just watching TV? They're going to get depressed. They're going to get fat. They're not going to have any friends. They're not going to have any memories of their childhood. Nobody thinks about the trade-off. Everything is straight to you let your child have one iota of freedom. What if something terrible happens? They see the iota. They see the rape, murder, and dismemberment, and they try to put them together, and, of course, it doesn't work. What I'm suggesting is let your kids have the kind of well-thought-out freedom with you training them. Train them to cross the street. Train them, don't go off with strangers. Train them to swim. I do think our job is to keep our children safe, but I don't think that the outside is so unsafe that we have to regard it as Predator's ball every time you open the door.
Of course, by the time kids reach their early teens, aren't they often out there seeking their own adventures, defining their own risks, and just not telling their parents what they're up to?
I have a feeling they are. I have a feeling mine are doing that right now because I'm 15,000 miles away or whatever I am.
Lenore Skenazy, thanks very much for talking with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Carrie. I'm so psyched to be here.